Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Founder Effect Roundtable. I know we are all missing you at LibertyCon this year. LibertyCon goes virtual, is very proud to present a roundtable on the anthology, The Founder Effect. If I had a copy of it, I would hold it up right now, but you can find it at Bain.com. You can find it wherever you order good books. And there we go. There's the Founder Effect with our great hero pose cover. Thanks, Mark. I would very briefly, I'm here with Sandra Medlock, who's my co-author, who helped me herd all of these cats. And a number of our authors from the anthology are here. We're going to talk a little bit about our stories, but we're going to talk about something that is a little bit larger than just the stories. I asked Larry Correia to write a foreword for the volume, and he did. And essentially what he said is mankind runs on legends. When we record history, history is often colored by the opinions of the people who are recording it, whether it is a written or an oral history. So in a sense, we get history as viewed through the lens of humanity. And that's what legends are. Here we are with about 250 years of official history of the United States and maybe about 400 years worth of history of the colonization. And we have legends. We have the legends of Paul Bunyan, of John Henry. We have the stories of Sacagawea and Pocahontas that have become much larger than the actual life events. So that's what we were trying to capture. So I also want to have Sandra chime in here a little bit about what we were trying to do with this volume.
You want me to chime in?
Yes, I do.
So I kind of left the story content up to Rob, or Speaker, as a lot of you probably know him. And I concentrated on just making sure everything was consistent, that it was continuous, that if you used one name at the beginning, you used that same name at the end of the story. And trying to keep up with Bain's requirements for grammar and punctuation was a lot of fun, particularly when it comes to commas and ellipses. So that was really where I worked with. But the other thing I was concerned about was the new writers that were chiming in on this anthology. I didn't want to change their voice for anything, even as we were looking at sentences that may be awkward or something like that. It's just a very strong opinion of mine as an editor is that you don't change the writer's voice. So that's basically what I did.
Thanks. There's also, she's being a little bit modest in not saying that a lot of the continuity and connectedness that these stories had is also largely due to her efforts as the editor. One of the things that I did was to propose a couple of different ideas, and with Tony Weisskopf's very wise guidance, we prepared one setting, a system that we call TRAPPIST 2. And at TRAPPIST 2, there is a very Earth-like world where our colony could be founded, and then left it open to the authors to decide what they wanted to do. And immediately I had two people tell me that they wanted to write the exact same story. My solution to this was not Derringers at Dawn, but actually for the two of them to communicate with each other. So I'd like David Weber and Mark Wandrey to tell us a little bit about what they came up with and how they came up with it.
Well, basically, we both wanted to write the story of the colony ship and its arrival, or not the colony ship, the terraforming ship that preceded the actual colony expedition. And I told Rob I wanted to do it, and he said, well, I'd be delighted for you to do that. But unfortunately, Mark got in first, like 14 seconds after I opened the topics. And he said, so why don't you call Mark? So I called Mark, and Mark and I started talking. And in the course of the conversation that we were having, he told me the story that he wanted to write. And I realized that there was a hook that I could run off the end of his story. So Mark, why don't you go ahead and tell them about what you had in mind, and then I'll tell them how I hooked onto the back end.
Well, essentially the idea I had was, since it was going to be a forward ship and there would be almost nobody on it for most of the trip, I had the idea of the guy who was the caretaker of the ship. And we had a theme that speaker was talking about, that there would be issues with this entire trip. And I thought, well, why don't we start this at the beginning? So we end up with this caretaker, this lonely guy who really only went because he was in love with somebody else who is going on a later trip. And he didn't fit the colony profile, but he did fit the profile for the kind of guy who would be alone on a ship and be able to run everything if anything went wrong. And it goes wrong, and he's not as good at his being alone as he thought he was. And the story is called Descent because he kind of slowly just goes insane in the process of this, realizing he only went because of this girl, and the girl really doesn't even know he exists is kind of part of the story. And that's where it segues in with David, because he saw the idea of being able to write this along with the other character, and then he takes over.
I told speaker earlier he doesn't need a mute button. I just need to bump my chair arm and I'll do it for him. I didn't really specifically set out to hook my character to Mark's character. It worked out very well that way, but my character is okay. The end result of what happens with Mark's character is that the terraforming ship kind of makes it to the target system, but doesn't get parked where it's supposed to be. So they are reduced to the backup terraforming ability that comes aboard the actual colony ship. And my story is about the pilot who is landing Shuttle Alpha, the whale. And her name is Joan, and her call sign is Jonah. Which means obviously that the lander winds up named the Whale since it's really big. And when she gets ready to land the colony, the shuttle as the first stage in colonizing the planet without the terraforming ship that was supposed to have had like 10 years to be building a foothold for them, she finds out that her software has been sabotaged. And she is sent on a one-way trip towards the far distant stars, taking all of the primary backup terraforming package with her and throwing the remaining colony on its limited resources for trying to establish a viable foothold on this planet that they do not have the capability to leave to go home. So that's kind of where we basically gave Rob the foothold that he needed to explain why all of these other survival stories become necessary in terms of the colony's history and the legends they were going to build. And we do sort of segue back around to this whole plot line for both stories at the very end of the collection. So Rob kind of, I don't want to use the phrase tombstone at the end of the book, but yes, we're sort of that too.
I would call it more of a bookend.
Well, that's because you're an editor.
So there are many reasons why colonies are going to fail on their own. Sometimes they get helped along. Celeste Johnson gave us a little bit of a story about why, what are some of the forces that might help along some of the troubles, and also what are some of the motivations behind the individuals who want to support a colony. Celeste?
Thanks, Rob. You said a comment in your introduction about the mythological people that we have in our past that we idolize, and I think we sometimes tend to forget. And I think, if anything, this last year has reminded us that every human being is flawed, right? And some people have good intentions and end up doing good things, and other people have ill intent and still manage to do good things or bad things along the way. And I wanted to play with that in the story called Confession. And in terms of getting it all started and how this whole project began, I kind of relied on personal experience to a degree, because I in my day job, I have proposed space missions, and some have been selected and some not. And you have to appeal to somebody to give them what they want. It's like a private business, right? But in the case, instead of the market, I'm appealing to scientists to give them science data. So I started thinking, when you put this challenge out there, of how do you sell a mission to do a one-way trip that's going to cost hundreds of billions of dollars in today's dollars, maybe more, when there's really no immediate commercial return. There's no, science dividend per se to bring back to any people, and not that science would justify that kind of an expense. And so I can just imagine knocking on doors saying, "Excuse me, do you have a few $100 billion to fly a mission to TRAPPIST so we can go settle people there? And what's the return on investment?" Well, you get nothing. You just feel good for doing this, right? So, what would be someone's motivation? And you gave us, I won't give away too much about the story, but Rob, not just in this volume, but in the volume he and I co-edited called Stellaris, he introduced a group of terrorists called Pfeffers, Earth Firsters, right? And sometimes, and I'll leave it at that with regard to Confession, sometimes people whose intent we might interpret as being evil can have an outcome that can be turned into something good. And especially when people who are involved have the knowledge of the importance of having these heroes and these mythological figures. And that if you shatter that myth prematurely, or if you sully that myth, you might endanger good things, even if those people are flawed. And that sometimes it's good to look at your history and acknowledge it, but you still want to maybe emphasize the things that allow you to achieve the goals you have in mind. And that's what Confession is all about, is people who aren't what they appear to be, impure motives, and how through motivation, someone else who is not perfect can maybe turn something bad into something good. And that's what I tried to do in the story.
I actually, we both owe the Pfeffers to Dan Hoyt. Dan created them for the story in Stellaris. And it should be said right here that Stellaris, which was an exploration of what humanity needed to be or to become in order to go to the stars, was about 1/3 nonfiction, about 2/3 fiction. And Dan gave us a story in which the characters, there was a character who wanted to go to the stars, and her parents did not want her to, and they were members of the Pfeffers, and so that's actually where they came from. So I just shamelessly used them for this as well.
Well, they're a great believable nemesis, I think, for stories like this, that there are people out there like that, and it was very believable. So thank you, Dan.
So I'm actually going to segue to Dan and then to Sarah, because there are many similarities in their stories. And I first say that Dan's story is one of the exploration journey, whereas Sarah's is one of the colonists. And we do have one other exploration story that we're going to come back to in just a minute, but because it also has implications for some of the later aspects of what happens to the colony, we'll come back to Chris Smith in a few more minutes. But Dan Hoyt gives us a tale of a character who is quite literally unbelievable. Dan?
Yeah, Sonny Strongbow. So part of this was the idea that every villain is a hero in his own story, coupled with the idea that legends can end up being having a duality of goodness and badness, depending upon who it is that actually believes the legend. And some of that actually has its roots in various religions. To use a very broad example, Christians believe Jesus was good and Muslims believe Jesus was bad. It's
Not
very
quite,
simple, but at a very simple level, not across all of this. But this is, just the kind of example that I was looking at. So what I wanted to look at and explore was the idea of what that legend would look like from two sets of factions down the road. One that believed he was a hero and one that believed he was a villain. And then contrast that with the actual person behind what the legend was. So it was a balancing act with told from multiple viewpoints to try to work out all those different views of what was going on. And then there's really a fourth viewpoint, which is the viewpoint of the main character, Sam, who was just trying to figure out what was going on, what happened, and all hinged around what could be considered just a plot device, Sonny Strongbow's notebooks, a MacGuffin.
And an interesting element of the MacGuffin in Sarah Hoyt's story, she references that a museum has Sonny Strongbow's boots, which caused our continuity people to say, so was he real or not? And the answer to that question is, we don't know. We leave that up to the readers.
And that was intentional in Sonny Stirs, was to leave it so we really weren't sure. And Sarah and I talked about it, and she threw the boots into the museum just to cloud the issue a little bit more.
Actually, Dan plotted this story at me during about an hour drive because he was trying to see it all in his head. And because it's complex.
Yeah, as I said, there's a number of threads that you have to keep going at any given time. And the trick was trying to keep the event along with the interpretations of the events at roughly the same time, so that you had an idea, so the reader could follow it.
So Sarah, why don't you tell us about your story? Oh, Brent, yes, you wanted to mention something. Go ahead.
Dan and I had also coordinated that something in his story might actually be part of the root cause of what happened in my story. So that raises further questions about whether Sonny Strongbow was real or simply he was real but not quite as depicted.
Right. And Brett and I talked about that. Brent, sorry, talked about that a number of times before I actually started writing it, because I wanted to tie into that ship in a way that, once again, just like the Sonny Strongbow legend, was absolutely unclear.
One of the things that actually is another little tie-in is that Sonny Stirs leaves it very uncertain how many people actually were on the ship. That was actually taken up by Brad Torgersen in his story, in which we learn that it's very likely that there were stowaways. If there's going to be a ship like this, there's going to be stowaways. Now it's a 160-year journey. They needed to have some sort of cryo suspension. But if the people who are installing the cryo suspension units and who are also working on the ship know where all the hiding places are, there's no guarantee we only had 10,000 cryo units on the ship. But
right. And we actually talked about that in the hotel room when we were talking about the story.
Right. So let's circle back around, because in many ways, Sarah's story now takes us into the colony, and there are various mysteries happening with the colonies. And again, we get to this idea that our narrator may or may not be reliable. And so that what we see in here may be what actually happened, or it may be something even stranger. Sarah.
When I first approached the project, I got cold feet because the only thing I could see writing about was the lost colony. However, you read about Roanoke and there's tons of theories, but there's places they could have gone because it's not an alien planet. So, yes, they could have been killed, or they could have been absorbed into one of the local tribes or whatever. But when you're in an alien planet, this becomes where did they go? So also I have problems writing in continuity, even in my own books. So this was a challenge. I decided to go in the future, and they don't know what happened to the lost colony. And you have two kids fooling around in the museum, and there's this crank theory that they opened the portal to escape. And over time, they've evolved that they had to have a gadget with them to open the portal because they had tried to open the portal and it didn't work. And these two kids are volunteering in the museum and supposedly found this gadget, and it's stole by the policewoman who is dealing with a frightened kid whose friend just disappeared. But in the end, even with the MacGuffin and the explanation, it still doesn't work because it's like, how could they all disappear in that time? Were they all, running information through a portal? And even then it wouldn't work. She does the math and it just wouldn't work. So what I wrote, in fact, was a horror story, because in the end, we just don't know. We don't know what happened to the colony. We don't know what happened.
So I guess you could say neither of us really knew what we were doing.
I think you knew very well what you were doing, because the whole idea is that legends are messy.
Yes.
Legends are not clean. And David wants to say something. I can tell. I see the look in his eyes.
I was just going to say that most of us in writing our stories for this worked on telling the reader what the kernel the legend was built around was, and how it was later embroidered and whatnot. And Sarah and Dan kind of went the other way around. They gave us the legend without giving away what actually happened to create it. And I think that was a nice piece of leavening for the anthology.
And the next two are actually variations on that theme. I know that Chris Kennedy needs to leave relatively soon, so I want Chris to tell us about the legend of Jimmy V.
Okay, I kind of went the other way, in that my story looks at this great legend of this guy that helped the original colony by slaying the monster. But it's from the perspective of Paul Harvey's old "And Now You Know" the rest of the story, which probably will date me some, since that probably hasn't been on the radio in a while. But anyway, so it goes back, and there is this hero, Jimmy V, and he was the colony's beekeeper, which you would think that really, okay, so what? He's the guy with the mead. He's the guy that was able to make the alcohol. So he was the hipster kind of guy that all the kids liked. They may not really have liked him so much, but they liked what he had. So they hung out with him, and he used that as a way to perhaps woo women, and perhaps give them plenty of mead and woo them. We'll just leave it at that. So as it occurs, he is in the middle of said wooing when all of a sudden the colony's monster appears, and shenanigans happen. and totally outside of his control, the monster gets killed right as somebody shows up and sees him, and he goes, "Hooray! Look at me, I've slayed the monster." And now you know the rest of the story.
But I think it's a great example. It's not just that, but he was in a little bit over his head.
He was in way over his head.
But that becomes the legend. That's where the legends come from. And it was actually fairly great. I usually tell everybody that that the cover of the anthology is how Jimmy V sees himself.
Exactly. That's exactly it.
That's the hero pose. Now, V. Raper took us in a little bit different direction with a similar type of story in which we're looking at a monster that threatens the colonies. And there are a number of different threats. Sarah's already alluded to the fact that we have a lost colony event. The colony that we named New Virginia when we described this, for a very specific reason, because it was going to disappear. It was going to die. And by calling it New Virginia, then we were able to name the renewed colony, the reestablished colony, Roanoke. Roanoke then becomes central to a number of our stories, as does V's. And I'll have V describe it in a little bit, but let me just say that my absolute favorite pastime, again, I'm dating myself, was Sunday supplement reading. And this actually strikes me very much as a Sunday newspaper supplement. V.
Okay, so yes, it is indeed a Sunday newspaper supplement, but The Hunt for the Sugenhound is actually based on a sort of, I'm a journalist by occupation, so it was kind of my narrative non-fiction version of a Wired or one of those Rolling Stone articles, the ones that have a slightly credulous journalist who goes out to report on some kind of myth or legend, and they encounter the local expert who's usually written a number of books, who talks about the myth and has an overarching passion. And the story is about the journalist reporting, effectively telling you all about this gentleman and about his motivations, but also about the myth behind and in terms of what he's devoted his life to investigating, which is the Sugenhound, which is a somewhat, I suppose, it was a little bit inspired by the Chupacabra. It was also inspired a bit by the Loch Ness Monster as well, because I'm a Brit and I went to, I've been to Loch Ness and I've been to the Loch Ness Museum, the one that's all about the sort of paranormal aspects, which is in a place called Drummond Docket. So it was a lot inspired by that as well. And the idea of the story is obviously that as you're reading it, you get the myth, you get the gentleman who's investigating the myth, you get the journalist reporting somewhat credulously on this. And I guess the fun for the reader is to work out what actually happened, because my motivation in doing it, and part of the joy I had in writing this story, was working out what exactly people saw and how exactly, in a sense, people engaged in collective myth-making about this monster. And I sort of don't know how much to give away, really, in terms of spoilers, because I guess part of the pleasure for people who are hopefully watching this and hopefully going to read the story is having a look at it and just trying to guess what exactly happened here and what exactly is the Sugenhound. Because it's a very Lovecraftian. I mean, I was very inspired by Lovecraft. I'd done a pastiche of Lovecraft at some point, in the past. So I was kind of inspired by this sort of existential horror monster. It is a horrible soul-sucking creature. And the idea is kind of what were people seeing and doing and thinking about and imagining, and how could they have a real person or a group of real people have kind of collectively created this myth. So it was inspired by a lot of modern myths, things that things like the Loch Ness Monster, things like the Chupacabra. So it was quite a lot of these. I've discovered recently there's one in Canada as well. The stories are quite similar. I was also inspired a lot by things to do with UFOs as well, and some of the paranormal stories and UFO kind of stories. But I was taking it from quite a scientific angle. So I was thinking, well, I'm going to assume there's nothing paranormal or fantastical happening here. This is, hard SF. So where do these stories come from? And it's a bit of an exploration of that. And it picks up a lot of sort of tropes of these real life stories as well. So I had a lot of fun writing it. And I think my favorite part was definitely the Sugenhound proof sunglasses, which appear near the end.
For our watchers and listeners, we've taken you from a natural disaster or not, as the case may be, with the issues with the colony ships, to several of the more natural monsters that they may encounter on the planet and provide difficulties. But one of the things that we're looking at, and particularly as you read and as you listen to Dan and Sarah's stories, as you listen to V's, you also make a trip into the legendary aspects. What is it that is causing, what are these stories going to become over time? And also kind of gets into your head the psychology of it. And so in the sense of looking at the psychology of it, I'm actually going to loop back now to Chris Smith's story during the colony ship's 160-year journey. So Chris, why don't you tell us a little bit about yours?
What I kind of set out to do was I was taking the legend aspect of it, things that have morphed into, a bigger story than they actually were. And I had been wanting to write, if not a horror story, at least a creepy story. And so to do that, I wanted to start out with, here we have this ship running on a skeleton crew. It's big. There's only, 5-6 people around at a time. After, I want to say it was 3 years, I believe, each shift or something like that. You're going to start kind of seeing things in the shadows that may or may not be there. Just knowing that from, being a kid and walking down a dark street, knowing that there's nothing there, but then all of a sudden that shadow looks like a bear. And all of a sudden, I don't want to be out here anymore. So I wanted to take that aspect and run with it. And then at, kind of at the end, give the explanation, but 200 years in the future, it was, oh man, did you hear about the haunted ship? So what I ended up writing was more or less a ghost story. And I wanted to have a, down to earth Ellen Ripley kind of character who is doing everything right that she knows how to do, but is still having these problems and can't figure out what's going on and getting freaked out about it. So I started out with the comfortable, homey kind of feel to the ship. Okay, we're settling in, we're the second, third shift. Everything's starting to kind of get scuffed and, made home, nesting, if you will. People have been nesting for a while. And I wanted to take that comfortable aspect of it and then start messing with it. And that way, as the character is experiencing this feeling of comfort dissolving around her, that she steps up and yeah, she's freaked out, but she's got to figure out what's going on. So, and it was a lot of fun to write.
Woven through all of what we have are encyclopedia articles. And so when the stories came in, Sandra and I talked about what various stories were. And again, she's being very, very quiet and very modest, but a lot of what we worked on together was figuring out what some of the connections would be and how we would tie this to a coherent mythology. And the authors really did talk to each other. And as a result, we have the occurrences in Chris's story are very important to a later story that unfortunately Phil, Doc Wohlrab is not with us today to talk about his story, but they involve, the link between them involves the same character. And I'm actually going to bring Cathe Smith in to discuss at this point, not so much her character, this linked character, but there is a linkage here, which is we've now taken the colony, has survived the monsters. It survived getting to the planet. They've survived the monsters. And now there's a totally different problem. And now we see some linkages between Phil Wohlrab's story, Cathe's story, and Monalisa's story. So we'll go with Cathe and then move on to Monalisa here in just a few minutes.
Okay. So what you end up having is, and this was kind of inspired by a short story I had done for Stellaris, and a research paper that I had been a co-author in, saying, okay, so we get to an alien planet, what if it's all incompatible with human life? Not because of like some new bacteria or something like this, but at a more fundamental level, what if the DNA is different? You know, on Earth, we generally have the 4 DNA bases, though they are making synthetic DNA bases, which would allow for 6, or I think they're up to 8 DNA bases now. What if you have an entire planet's ecology like this? How would that interact with Terran ecology? And, you know, going in with what happens if you have prions develop, which are malevolent proteins, is the best way to think of them. They aren't really a virus, they aren't a bacteria, they're protein chains that, like in the case of Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, eat away at your brain and your higher cognitive abilities. And you see this in like chronic wasting disease in deer, you see it in a few other diseases in sheep and cattle. So what happened, and they're subtle diseases. It's not really something like, wow, you're breaking out in pustules, we know what this is. It's a slow breakdown as these malevolent proteins build up in your system, usually in your brain matter. And it can have other effects because it just starts making your other systems just break down and not react like they should. So that plays in with Phil Wohlrab's story into, well, it looks like a disease. It looks like, you know, it's got these symptoms, but it's not reacting to the medications or the treatments that we know would work on these diseases. So what's going on? And then playing into Monalisa and my short story, it's why are these certain Terran animals that we have brought and are feeding on adapted diets, why are they not thriving either? So in my case, it's cattle, and in Monalisa's case, it's dogs. And cattle provide a lot for us. I mean, yeah, you've got the meat, but you've got muscle power if your engines break down in the form of oxen. You've got milk, you've got leather, you've got all manner of thing that comes from your average domesticated cow. And if you suddenly don't have that, yeah, you can substitute goats and sheep in for that, but they're smaller and there are other trade-offs that have to occur. So being humans, you know, if we can't come up with a Terran solution to a Cistercian problem, maybe we need to come up with a Cistercian solution to a Cistercian problem. So in my case, that turns into, how do we domesticate an alien cow?
And let's not also forget the other thing that cattle provide us with is the rodeo.
Yes. Well, yes. When you have a former rodeo queen decide to go to an alien planet and she can't have her rodeos anymore, well, that just can't be born. So something's got to give.
And with the diseases, again, Phil Wohlrab's story centers around the humans that get the disease, and Cathe's centers around the cattle getting the disease. What if the dogs get the disease and we don't have the dogs anymore? As Cathe just mentioned, one of the very important substitutes would be goats and sheep in terms of domesticated food animals, milk and meat, and also their hides, their fleece, and the like. So Monalisa brings us a story of what do we do when we don't have our dogs? And you're still muted. There you go. You're still muted.
How about
there you
now?
Go. There you go.
Okay. So I decided to write about the dogs because we human beings seem to have this need for our companion animals, and I have a little bit of a connection with people that do things like raise guide dogs and rescue dogs and working dogs. So it seemed like a good idea to write about one of the things that makes us human, and that's the things that we value, and we value individuals, and we also value this bonding that we do, and we'll bond with anything. And we decided to go ahead and write the story about them coming up with robotic dogs in order to do the job of the sheepdogs until they could figure out how to save the actual dogs and so that they wouldn't die from this disease. And that's how we ended up with Cerberus Project. And one of the reasons I dedicated it to Norman Borlaug is because he's the man that saved 1 billion lives. And I wanted Mina, his namesake, to do the same thing, to save the colony so one person's actions saved the colony. And I had a lot of fun with this because it gave me a chance to research things like how AIs learn. And I talked to someone and found out far more than I had ever known about what AIs are and how AIs would work once we actually mastered them. And it was very interesting. And one of the things that he told me is, well, you could have them watch videos of the dogs herding sheep, and that's how they would learn how to herd sheep, because obviously we didn't have any other way of training them. And not to give too much of the story away, they are intelligent and they can do things that they're taught, and they can somewhat extrapolate, but they're not actual AIs in the way that we would think of human beings being sapient. And so they would have some limitations. And that's kind of where the plot for the story came from, is the things that could go wrong and how they would problem solve and work together and come up with different solutions to the same problem, depending on the individual robot.
One of the themes that runs through the Founder Effect, not by any design of mine, is the problem with the AIs. And actually, that really comes back. This is one of the circle back moments. Mark, why don't you come back again and tell us what happened to the AIs?
You want me to give me the detail, or?
Yeah, just in general, why? We would expect that there would be a lot of AI on the planet supporting our colonists, but there is not, and there's a reason for it.
The ship was decided, Prometheus, the first ship, because of its purposes. Most of it could be done by computers and AIs. So it was a highly automated mission, was the conception behind it. And with a higher level of automation, you obviously have a higher level of issues. And that's why Dave, my character, was sent, because he was an AI expert. That was his thing. And they figured, well, if anything goes wrong, this would be the guy to fix it. Well, nobody had conceived of the possibility of what if something really goes wrong, and not with the colony, but the ship itself, which is run by probably the most sophisticated AI that he helped it design. But he only helped it. He didn't do everything. So what do you do if everything fails and you basically have to start over from scratch? And that's kind of the challenge that he faces. So on top of being alone for years and years and years on end, he is now faced with the daunting challenge of not only redoing what he helped do in the first place, but extending that onward to systems within the ship that he never was involved in except basic maintenance classes. Congratulations, Dave. This is your mission. Now, here's how you fix the life support system and how you fix these other things. And he may or may not have paid as much attention as he was supposed to. And he finds that out when he actually has to fix all this stuff. It was a lot of fun working with him because he's an extremely introverted character. And I'm not saying I'm introverted too, but you know, we all wish we were alone until we really are alone. And then he has to fix everything too. And it's, you know, how much can it, the story in its essence, a lot of it is how much can one person take before they kind of start cracking at the seams. And it was really fun exploring that with this guy.
But it did give us a really nice thread to weave through this, which is the dependence, the loss, and the potential distrust of the AIs. Yes, David.
One of the other factors that weaves through here is that what happens to the AI isn't necessarily the AI's fault. It's not the fault of the technology that the technology fails. Do we want to touch on that at this point, or do we want to? I'm asking you, Rob.
I'm actually going to circle back to that because I'm using this as a launch point into the next description, because what we have is we have a failure of the AIs, and yet in Monalisa's story, we actually have a success of the AIs. In general, we have the failures, but the AIs provided the Cerberus project with a dog substitute with respect to the shepherds. But Jody, Lynn, and I also gave us a story with an AI, and with an acknowledgement, she and I communicated. She said, how prevalent are the AIs? And the answer is not very prevalent. She said, well, could I have an AI virtual assistant for somebody who is forced to become mayor, and forced under circumstances that actually weave back to Cathe and Doc and Monalisa's stories. The prion disease takes a lot of victims, and that leaves people who are in secondary positions now in command of their respective town or their respective company or group. And so in No Time for Princes, Jody, Lynn, and I has given us a story of an individual who's forced to head a research project and forced to become mayor, and creates basically creates an AI assistant and kind of over personalizes it, which is part of the fun of the story. And again, gets us back into this legendary aspect. By the way, it's the AI being a little offbeat that also weaves through Chris Smith's story and his horror story. There is a little bit of hope for the colony. One is that they're going to launch another, they reserved one lander for one more colony site. And that leads us into a section of hope and redemption following when things get really, really bad. But before we get there, we had a nice little interlude with a delightful story that tells us what happens when you start getting these genetic restrictions, and the different colonies realize that You know, the way to solve this problem of the genetics is to let's go steal brides from another place. So Dave Butler, why don't you tell us about Looney Tunes?
So I knew I was going to have to lean pretty heavily on the folklore, and I saw the list of other people who were contributing, you know, Cathe and Les and Rob, and I thought, man, this is a bunch of science people. I'm going to look dumb. So so I have literally a story within a story, and the frame story is two brothers who are pulling some kind of little crustacean creature out of a beach, getting ready for the marriage of their older brother, collecting food, and talking about bridal customs, which apparently includes bridal kidnapping. By the way, as a bit of background, my great grandfather Wandrey kidnapped his bride. So in Reno, Nevada, they were both from both Serbian from the old country, and that was how you did it. Everybody was aware. The parents were all involved. There was some kind of bride price paid. You know, there was mock outrage, and the young woman, the young bride, went off with her new husband. So yeah, I'm familiar with the idea of a founder effect, principally in organizational behavior contexts, companies where the impact of the ideas or behaviors, even bad ones, of the founders of the company linger on for years and years after they're gone, because they dominated a time when there were few people, and so those behaviors, those ideas get passed on. But I knew that you had a similar effect in genetics, and I saw that in the sketched out history of these colonies, that at a certain point you had four different groups, and they were not necessarily friendly to each other. One in particular had become collectivist, and I said, this is perfect, because if you're on one of those colonies, you have three other colonies. This sets up a fairy tale structure, and a repeated quest three times exactly perfectly. So it's about the middle brother, who clearly understands a little more what's going on, explaining to the younger brother why the oldest brother has kidnapped his bride, in the form of a fairy tale about the three brothers who first did this, and how they went out and tried to negotiate and buy brides from the other colonies to because they knew this would overcome the genetic challenges they were seeing in themselves, and in each case were forced to ultimately both pay and also run away with the young woman. So part of the logic being, this allows groups that on the one hand they can express hostility towards each other and have tension, and yet still they can mutually solve their genetic problem by this ritualized exogamy. So yeah, Looney Tunes is about the kidnapping of brides among the four colonies.
I think it also perfectly illustrates why, for a hard science fiction anthology, we did not limit ourselves to hard science fiction authors, because yes, we're authors who could play in that field, but these are legends. These are stories, and it gets us a little bit into the fantasy realm as well, which is one of the reasons why I will always say I'm thrilled with how that story continued the idea of the legends.
Thank you.
And again, I mean, Chris's is a horror story. Sarah's is a police procedural. Dan's is a mystery, and V's is, I mean, we can just keep going around the circle about what different styles were brought to it. One of the things, if you go back to Robert Heinlein's classic, The Green Hills of Earth, you get the story of either the lone hero or the heroic team that sacrifice themselves to save an important ship, or to save just to save their ship. We get the story of sacrifice from the Legend of Beaver Flight. Brent Roeder, this is not exactly your debut story, since you debuted in Stellaris, but this is one I have to tell people. This story actually predates the Founder Effect. Brent actually had this story first, and then when Sandra and I pitched the Founder Effect to Tony Weisskopf, I already knew I wanted this story in it. So Brent, why don't you tell us a bit about Beaver Flight?
Yeah, so as Rob was saying, this story dated the Founder Effect. So when Rob came back to me, and it's a story about one of the landers trying to land on the planet. So when Rob came back to me and said, "Hey, David Weber wants to write a story about one of the landers," I was super excited that, oh goody, one of my first ever stories, and I get to go up against David Weber. So yeah, so that was a little bit of heart-stopping for a moment, but actually I ended up coordinating with David and Mark. We had a nice chat. So actually I made my story in partly because of David. The loss of his lander actually was the reason why the heroes of my story were in place to do something about what happens with my lander. While a lot of other stories talk about how you have the story of what happens and you have the myth and legend, how that grows, and there's uncertainty about what happens, I took a slightly different tack where everyone knows exactly what happens. They actually have recordings of the radio transmissions. What gets changed is everyone's intentions. So the main character and his crew of tug pilots become these noble, self-sacrificing heroes who are valiantly doing things for the safety of the colony. In reality, the senior tug pilot, is really pissed off that people are making him look bad at his job. And he's not going to have anyone make him look bad on his job, even if it means dying to save the lander. So I did it where we took that and then we looked at, okay, they know exactly what happened, but how do people remember what happened? So we kind of go back and forth between the present day of the colony where they're remembering and what was going on at the time to kind of give that juxtaposition. And then we end with a ceremony for how they remembered the sacrifices, which we actually were then able to tie in later on with Wandrey's story. And it ended up coming nicely back full circle.
And there were a couple of other tie-ins as well, because it is quite possible that one of the reasons why this final lander failed may have something to do with something Sonny Strongbow did, which is another one of the tie-ins back with Dan's story. So it was a lot of fun putting a lot of this together. We also have a few implications, and maybe it had something to do with all those stowaways from Brad Torgersen's story as well. And
then while they saved the lander, or at least all the people on the lander itself kind of got bent around the edges, so to speak, which started setting up the follow-on, for example, with Cathe's story, helped set part of the scenario for her story and what was going on at that colony site.
This actually brings us back to then a tale of redemption, which brings us back to David and Mark. And tell us a little bit about Fire from Heaven.
Okay, in the short story that I wrote for the front end of the anthology. My pilot, Joni Walker, she's got the Alpha Shuttle. The Alpha Shuttle has an additional 50 colonists in cryo aboard it, because it is the something killed the robotics. This is how we do the terraforming with hand labor shuttle. It has an entire fusion plant. It has basically everything that they need to set up a foothold with human supervision and agency in the loop every single step of the way. And then she gets shot off into interstellar space. And she becomes a legend over the next 50, 60, 70 years. She's the Flying Dutchman of Sestertia. There's this story about how she is eternally trying to reach the planet that she never was able to set foot on. And then 80 years later, they get a transmission from her. And they find out that she had potential salvation for herself in her hands and deliberately discarded that possibility to buy 11 seconds of time on the thrusters for her shuttle, even when she didn't know she was going to need them. She voluntarily died to put those 11 seconds in the bank because she found Prometheus, and she had the possibility of rendezvousing with the long lost AI colony ship. And she wasn't going to risk her calculations. She didn't know if she was going to have to do some last minute, the whale was going to have to do some last minute maneuvering. So she sets up a whole hierarchy of programs that will give her hopefully access to Prometheus. So he knows something's wrong with the ship, and given the fact that her AI dumped on her, she has a pretty good idea that Prometheus had similar problems. So this story opens 80 years later. The new captain, or the current captain of the colony ship, who grew up on the orbital habitat with Joan, is on the watch when they get this transmission coming in the Colony Foundation's secret, private cipher, and they bring it up on screen, and there's Joan from 80 years ago, and she tells them what happened. And I won't tell you exactly how, well, I will tell you because Mark's going to have to, when he touches on his story. They managed to bring Prometheus back into orbit with all of the support that they had lost 80 years into the colony. Okay? And that's where I'm going to leave it for Mark.
So David, in his dark moments while he's working, still managed to get an amazing amount done, considering that the AIs contain billions of lines of code. He gets enough done to realize that he can probably put the ship into an orbit, but it's never going to be what it was supposed to be, because he's not going to be able to write the program so it'll make all these decisions as it enters orbit. And the ship was supposed to examine its possible destinations and modify all this. He wasn't an astrophysicist. He's not a colonist. He's just a computer programmer. And he says, well, I know if I can get the ship into enough of an orbit, then eventually it'll come back around and maybe they'll find the ship. And the other problem too is he won't be alive probably. He's not going to live long enough to probably survive because of the minimal life support the ship has, how long he's already been awake. He's doing a lot of damage actually because he's eating supplies in the ship that was meant for the colonists. He was never supposed to be awake. So when he makes his final decision and realizes he can put it in this orbit, he rolls the dice and he puts himself in cold sleep and says, well, maybe someone will wake me up. I hope I've fixed enough of the ship. And just as David said, when she puts her own ship in this orbit, she spots the Prometheus way out there in this orbit and goes, you know what? Maybe we can link up. And that's what she pulls off. And David, ironically, the character's name is David. He is able to right enough of the programs that when Prometheus sees the shuttle, they're allowed to intercept each other. And then the automated programs that were not part of the AI take over. And that's when these messages go out. And like he said, it's a shot from heaven. They're barely surviving. And all of a sudden here comes this monstrous ship full of yummies and all the goodies and supplies, not AIs, but, power supplies and things. And David is woken up by these guys. He's been in cold sleep all this time. And he's half mad when he wakes up. It's not it's a pretty crazy scene actually, because he's all these delusions in his head that he was living with himself.
He spent 12 years. He spent 12 years by himself, awake on that ship, trying to fix it.
And by the end of it, he was gone. He was barely sane. So you meet him after he's been woken up, and the ship and the Prometheus is now with the colony. They brought it into orbit of Trappist, and he's been going through therapy to try to bring him back from the edge. And once he's finally starting to get seen, he realizes he has nothing to do, actually. All these young people have taken over all the jobs. He's almost completely superfluous. And then eventually he realizes there is one thing he can do. And I really don't want to say what that is, but that then ties in with David Weber's story about Joan, which is that woman that he was in love with and never really had a chance to even meet, because he's found out that she died decades, almost a century ago. So he realizes there's one thing he can do, and that's what he does ultimately.
Yeah. Let me throw in that when he puts himself back into the cryo aboard Prometheus, he knows that the cryo system is going to be unreliable.
Yep.
So it's not just a case of will they ever find me? It's a case of even if they find me, I may just be a very well-preserved corpse.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, he's really, I think in many ways, he is in the darkest place of any character in this entire anthology.
Because when he's woke up too, it isn't because the system woke him up, it's because it crashed. And it takes him out of cold sleep because the computer, the AI took care of that as well. So he just all of a sudden wakes up in the middle of this. And so it goes from bad to worse to horrible to unthinkable. It's just all the way through.
Yeah.
And we were able to take this and tie the stories back together very nicely.
Beautifully.
I wrote the encyclopedia entries in an effort to give us a little bit of tie together, but really the consistency is due to the authors communicating with each other, and also Sandra actually did a fair amount with talking with some of the newer writers, some of the younger writers, in a way, is this what you want? Is that what you want? We got a little bit of feedback from Tony Weisskopf on a couple of stories that are just stylistic issues that really helped us. Although Tony's, I have to say right off the bat that Mark had a fairly dark ending. I wanted him to lighten it up, and Tony made me let it go dark again. And that's actually, that was actually pretty neat in the way that worked out. And Sandra had a lot to do with helping capture those feelings. Did you want to say something there?
I also want to say that we tied in Sunny Stirs back into Wandrey's story, because we took a security guy that Dan had created and kind of put him in a couple places at the end of David Palmer, interacting with David Palmer.
Yeah, it actually is pretty significant, really. It was right at the very end. They were right there together.
And it's really because we wanted to sort of reinforce this idea, did Sunny really exist or not? Was there, to use in an example from American legend, was there really a John Henry? If there was a John Henry, and there are some indications that there was, he was a railroad worker. He probably was not probably not the hero and the strong man that was of the John Henry story, but you get this idea, hey, there is a real person behind this story, and we really wanted to work with that. brings us back to the idea that these are how the legends form. All of these stories together are how the legends form. And there were some interesting rabbit holes we went down. Monalisa and I with the AIs. And then the idea that humans will adopt and consider a pet anything. You know, would a mechanical AI dog actually be treated as a dog by the humans? Would these cross between a triceratops and a bison be treated as cattle? And a number of other considerations throughout all of this. And if the individuals named had to look at how history treated their story, would they even recognize themselves? We played around a little bit of this with Doc Wohlrab's story as well. Go ahead.
One of the things, okay, I was going to say earlier, the continuity in an anthology like this, if you don't have the right editors, if you don't have them allowing the authors, as Sandra said earlier, to speak in their own voices and somehow binding it together, the serendipity effect of the stories can very easily be lost. And that is something that you guys very strongly avoided in this anthology. And I think you deserve a lot of credit for that. The other thing that I wanted to say is that one of the things that runs through all of these stories is the fact that if you talk to anybody who won the Congressional Medal of Honor or whatever, almost all of them will say, hey, I was just there and I had it to do. Okay. These people are not setting out to create legends. And I don't think that it really matters to any of them how they're going to be regarded. I think that for us as the readers thinking about how they would react to it, that's one thing. But I don't think that there is a single heroic, and I use the term advisedly, character in this entire anthology who wasn't just meeting his or her responsibilities. And I think that is a key element in what most of us think makes a heroic character to begin with. And I think that that is a key element that runs through every single one of these stories.
I had a reviewer contact me and said he really wanted to know, did we intend this? Yeah, how his question was, how much direction did I give the authors? And the answer to that is I gave you a timeline. But his comment was that he actually thought that the hero pose on the cover didn't really capture the idea that these are just ordinary people. And I think that what really hits home, whether you're talking about the rodeo queen who's coming up with a substitute for the cattle, in a way, Cathe's story is also about the graduate student who inadvertently ends up riding one of the frill horns, as just like the Dan's story of Sonny Strongbow is more about the guy in the bar collecting the story. You know, the central character is, okay, does this person end up believing the story or not? Is it true or not? As Dave Butler's story of the bride stealing, but is it true? Well, but that would just be Looney Tunes, wouldn't it? And I like the fact that we were able to put together this story. There has been a couple of mentions, and there is a fourth colony that never got really explored in these stories that perhaps we'll have that explored in a future volume. And I am looking at trying to get us a future volume where we can explore this a little bit more.
Hey, Rob, this is Les. I just want to interject something. You know, I have this view that history is made by people doing their jobs. And I think this builds off what David was saying, is that, you know, we have heroes, absolutely. But a lot of times those are heroes, and I use it, you know, hero, heroine. They're doing their job in difficult circumstances, but they're doing their job. And there are a lot of everyday heroes that are just people that are doing the right thing and what they're supposed to be doing. And I think this anthology kind of exemplified that, is that you had people put in extraordinary situations and they just did their job. They did what they had to do. And a lot of people in face of adversity run away from that. And these people didn't. And that's what makes them different, in my opinion.
I think it reminds me a little bit of the officer in Starship Troopers addressing Rico and the other young officers and using the example of the battle on the Chesapeake. And he says, you know, if you get dropped into that situation, I expect you to die, but I expect you to die doing your best. And that, I think, is exactly what you're talking about here. And I think it is one of the reasons why humans need heroes, and why they take these people who died doing their jobs, which is heroic, and turn them into larger than life heroes, rather than just saying, this guy, this gal, they died where they stood to get the job done, to meet their responsibilities.
I think that's great when you consider who the main characters are. We have a police officer, we have a rancher, we have the tugboat, the orbital tug captain, team leader that says, these people are making me look bad. I'm just doing my job. When you have the guys who were just talking about, you know, what does it take, the bride stealing, you know, but you know, we're just doing what we have to do. I think it's great because, and again, this is not not so much the instruction that I was giving to the authors, but what the authors pulled themselves in the idea and put together and put in print. I think that is just absolutely awesome.
Well, there, as has been pointed out twice now, there's a lot to do with the editors too. I mean, as I was putting pieces of the story together, I bounced it off Rob, and Rob would then say, oh, you know what, we may be able to tie this into this other story here. So, you know, it's not like we were all having, you know, like dinner together and talking about our stories. We're bouncing it up through the editor and getting him to make those kind of detailed connections throughout it. So the cohesiveness of the entire volume is in a large part because Rob was able to manage all that and see where those connections made sense.
Well, and I knew about the Beaver Flight story when I was working on Kamakura, my short story at the beginning of the anthology. And so I was able to lay a little groundwork in there because I knew this later story was coming along, by having the captain and the exec of the ship say, if we'd had tugs in position, we might have been able to stop this, you know, kind of thing. So when you move up to Beaver Flight, when they're getting ready to put down the last of the shuttles, the one that's been in reserve for so long, damn straight, they're going to have the tugs where they need them to be. But the situation they have is worse than any that they projected. And that's why Beaver Flight has to step up and do the heroic thing.
But again, a lot of that was not me telling you. That was you talking with Brent talking with you. That's where I think the value of this has come. And it is, to give an idea of the coordination, Les, by the way, said that having all of us sitting around a dinner table discussing the stories would be an awful lot of fun. And the only problem we have there is about 6,000 miles and 7 time zones to put all of us in one place. But it would, in fact, be a lot of fun and would have made for an excellent way to plot out the stories. But we did it virtually instead. So, and Dave, you're right. We could do this at Dragon Con sometime. We'll have to do this at Dragon Con sometime. But
you know what would be really cool would be to do it as a panel. It would be kind of a giveaway for, of where are we going to go with these stories. But I will guarantee you there would be fans who would pay good money to sit in the audience to watch the sausage being made.
We did a panel similar to this called Chimera Cordon Bleu.
Oh, good Lord, that was terrible.
Where the idea was to just kind of come out with ideas of how you would use them to cook.
A cookbook with alien things.
The problem was we had somebody scheduled someone on the panel who didn't know that it was a joke and thought we were actually talking about real recipes. And he was horrified.
He was a chef. I mean, when they got to the mermaid, the poor man almost fainted. So.
Yeah, kept looking at us sideways like, they know they're not real, right? But it would be fun to do that sort of thing, just to pull a stories together, and even to pull the entire anthology, which can be, the follow-on.
Didn't Harlan Ellison do something like this with Medea's World? Didn't that come from a convention panel?
I don't remember, but it certainly could have.
It would be a lot of fun. Maybe I should suggest something to Sue Phillips that we do at either that or as somebody said, we sit around at the next Interstellar Research Group meeting. And thank you, Les, because I am going to mention that right now. We have made a number of references to a predecessor volume called Stellaris, which came out of the Tennessee Valley Interstellar Workshop of 2016. In that, we put together a working track whose job was to discuss what did humanity have to become to go to the stars. And we turned that into the book because we really wanted to have some product that said, okay, what's some of the reality? We'll have some nonfiction. What are some of the dreams? And we'll have the authors contribute to it. Well, it continues to be a fairly strong influence on us is the Interstellar Research Group, which is the successor to TVIW. And our next Interstellar Symposium is going to be in September in Tucson. And actually, Les, I'm gonna send over to you and have you tell people a little bit about this, and we can make our pitch right now.
Yeah, that'd be great. Yeah, for folks that are interested, the Interstellar Research Group is kind of a hybrid between a professional space conference and a science fiction convention. And we get membership from both. And the goal is to get serious about talking about how we go to the stars and realizing it's not just scientists and engineers that are going to do it. It's the people who make the myths, the stories. It's the general person off the street. So we have a series of talks, not all of which are technical. We have these working tracks, like Rob mentioned, where we get people in a room and we start tackling the issues that have to be addressed of how we might go to the stars and how we bring the society to a point where it can support a trip like that. Several folks on this call have been great supporters of the meetings. I'm thinking particularly of Sarah and Dan, who have gone out of their way to come to a lot of these meetings over great distances. And this is still a distance, but it's not as much as it was, right? We're going to be in Tucson. And we have an art show, which is kind of a carryover from science fiction fandom. We even have a hospitality suite. And so it's in September. Go to irg.space. I believe it's I don't remember the exact dates. It's like the 21st or the 24th, something like that. I don't have it in front of me here, I'd tell you. I'm the program chair for that. But check it out. We'd love to have you. And it's a lot of fun. It's like a focused science fiction convention, a lot of good discussion, and you might learn something. So.
And it really plays up the idea of it's not the heroes that are going to go to space. It's the workers. It's the engineers. It's the scientists who have to be on the spot in order to conduct their science. When we're founding an interstellar colony, we need to have farmers. We need to have ranchers. We're going to have geneticists. We're going to have somebody. We're going to have security officers and sheriffs and police officers. We're going to have shepherds. We're going to have the agronomist who goes around planting apple orchards and who gets in trouble because they plant apple orchards. There is a founder effect story that is not in the volume, and it's called Appleseed, and it is on the Baen Books website. So www.baen.com/Appleseed. And it is a Johnny Appleseed story that takes us as well. And so the terraformers are not these people with these huge giant engines that create an Earth-like environment on the planet. They're the farmers, they're the planters, they're the plant geneticists that are going to figure out how a plant is going to live. And we need the historians, and we need the journalists, and we need the artists who are going to create a livable society. And I really like to think that that's what we've done with the founder effect, is given a look at what the society is going to be like, and particularly with the legends, particularly with how we view the ordinary acts that become extraordinary.
Yeah, David Butler put up the dates. It's September 24th through the 26th in Tucson. irg.space is where you can learn more about it.
And we would definitely like to have folks come out and join us. I've been involved for quite a few years. I've been involved since the second one, second symposium. Les has been involved and founder of the symposium. Let's see, Brent has been there, Monalisa has been there. We've had Sandra and Cathe. And as a matter of fact, Sandra and Cathe and Phil Wohlrab were part of the group that helped run the Stellaris working track. That was the genesis of that volume as well. So we definitely owe a lot to the Interstellar Symposium in terms of the genesis of this volume as well. Definitely looking to see if we can put another volume together and see if we can't continue the legends. And let me open up again if there are any other comments that the individual contributors would like to make.
I'm just saying, if the second anthology happens, I have a story. Yeah.
I've had a few people tell me that.
I think that one of the things that I like about collaborations when they work the way they're supposed to, I tell people is, collaborations, which this really is in a way, even though it's an anthology, because of how tightly the stories are linked by the time you get to the end. The only reason really to do a collaboration is if it will be at least as good as any of the writing partners would have done alone, and yet different from what any of them would have done alone. In this case, I think that the synergy involved in bringing all these people together definitely produced something that is absolutely as good as any of us would have done alone, and I think probably better in terms of the continuity, the texture, the multiplicity of viewpoints and points of access into what is a story that runs just from the time they arrive in the star system. It runs 80 plus years of people actually interacting on the planet, and then wraps up with the celebration of Founding Day at the very end. as kind of a capstone. So it's been a very satisfying project from my perspective. And I think anybody who hasn't read it is, well, aside from being an evil person, okay, if you haven't already read it, you need to go out and find it, simply because I think that it is, while not unique among anthologies in the quality and the caliber of the stories, I think it is unique in terms of how the story it tells is made up of so many component parts that all fit together so well at the end of the tale.
And they do fit. They really do fit together.
Yeah. And that was not just a factor of the folks who wrote the stories and they happened to go together. We've talked a little bit before about editorial input and so forth. I think Rob sells himself a little bit short from the beginning, where he set up the basic timeline and how he explained to us what was supposed to be done in terms of the stories, what the where the anthology was headed from this starting point. Okay, that right there provides a basis for continuity that is frequently lacking in anthologies. And then keeping us in contact and saying, oh, well, so and so is doing a story that could possibly tie, here's what they're doing, take a look at it, it may impact what you're doing. Okay, there's no, this is what I need you to do in that. There's here is something that you might want to explore because I think it might make what you're doing stronger. That's good editing.
I want to add in on that, David. While Rob was limited in what he told people ahead of time, what he did do, and there was a lot of work behind the scenes, is going, okay, we have this from this author and it's canon. We have this from the other author, and he'd go in and backfill between them to figure out how they connected, how they had to interact, and also where were the possibilities for them conflicting. So we didn't accidentally have people trying to constantly retcon each other throughout.
Yeah. Well, just when I was working on the whale and how the whale was going to land and what the whale was going to do, you and I were going back, and this is the size, this is the, and I'm like, well, I need a little more endurance. It's like, okay, fine, we can put more tankage in, kind of thing. That's good editing too. And it's also, number one, it's the writer being respectful of the tech capabilities and limitations of the universe and of the editor, but it's also the editor being respectful of the writer and saying, okay, if this is the story that you need to tell and this is the voice you need to tell it in, how can we make this work without violating what we've already established as the fundamentals, and then communicating that to everyone else as an add to your continuity checklist. That was done very well on this as well.
Well, before everything got written, we had a vague sketch of what the ship sort of might look like. And then by the time we had the stories in, we actually had a design for the ship, and we're arguing, well, are we sure that the cargo bay would be there, or would it have to be a little bit more forward?
Real quick, if I can jump in.
Yeah.
Rob has mentioned a couple, not today, but in the past, about getting a 1-star review saying the science was terrible in this volume. And so I wanted to jump in and say thanks to everybody who made the science actually not terrible that this person couldn't see, because Rob was instrumental in helping me flesh out exactly how my story was going to work, and based on the neuroscience involved. I'm certain that Les and others with the various specialties, Cathe's and Brent and et cetera, if I'm forgetting anybody, I'm sorry, we're instrumental in helping everything out and keep the science grounded, extrapolated but grounded. So that's it. That's all I want to say. Thanks.
I agree with you on that. I mean, I almost didn't participate in this project because I am a scientist, and I worry about that sort of thing. But I knew that with Rob involved and with Les involved, that I knew I was going to have solid science. And I talked to Brent about the Beaver story before I even agreed to do anything. And once I knew what he was doing and what he was trying to go for, then I was convinced that there was that they had an idea of what they were doing. I've never done effectively a shared world story before, so I wasn't really comfortable with the idea at first, and until I knew that the science was going to be solid.
Well, it's good when the collective brain has at least 4 or 5 neurons that know their science.
Well, we have 3 PhDs.
Yeah, I know.
and a number of master's level engineering and science people as well. I want to bring Brad Torgersen in, and I apologize for any timing confusions here. And the thing is that it's very difficult at times to coordinate across time zones. And so Brad, and I know Brad, you've had a very, very busy spring. And so thank you for joining us.
It's my fault. It's all my fault.
No, it's okay. Don't worry about it.
I apologize. What I was going to say is, we talk about the science. So a few years ago, I had a story appear in Analog magazine. And my rule with the science is I try to make it credible, but I'm not a PhD, certainly not. And I generally do okay. This story ran, it got a Reader's Choice Award in Analog. That should be good enough, right? Well, no, of course it wasn't. There was a very nice, very helpful reader who took it apart in the letters section, which I tried to be very magnanimous about, because he was right. This was, I think, a PhD guy in math. And he said, you got your math wrong on how long it took your starship to go from this planet to this planet. And I just had to do a mea culpa and say, you know what, you're right. Thank you. And then I was reminded of the old story about how Larry Niven, when he did Ringworld, people they didn't take it apart, but they pointed out problems with Ringworld that ultimately forced him to write a sequel, because he had to explain, okay, here's the holes in my initial concept for this huge structure that circles a star. Now I need to fix it. So you can never get it exactly right enough for every single reader. Don't stress too much about it.
Brad, why don't you tell us a little bit, and I mentioned this earlier, you gave us a story of the journey that was really very unexpected to me. I had not even considered the idea of stowaways.
So in my brain, we talked about earlier, I think it was David who and Brent were talking about, we had no idea what this huge ship was going to look like. So I'm picturing this big mammoth, extremely large thing. And while I'm toying with this idea in my head, I was reminded of in Kim Stanley Robinson's Mars trilogy, which is an excellent hard science trilogy, in my opinion. He had a stowaway, which I had never thought of before either. But I thought if you're going to send people to the stars, and you have this mammoth vessel that's going to require potentially thousands, maybe even tens of thousands of workers to put it together, I thought there's going to be at least one, probably several people who are going to be building the thing, who are going to be kind of chafed that they're not going to be going along for the ride. And some of those people, and now, okay, I'm a warrant officer, we do this, think, well, who's to tell me I can't do this? So I thought, well, what if I do a stowaway story? I thought maybe that would be a different angle for the book. And it worked. And I was really glad that you liked it and that you thought it was a different angle for the book, because I thought we have so many quality people in here who are going to be coming at it from so many different angles that this would be one that would be worth exploring. So I'm glad you liked it, and hopefully people liked it. I've gotten a few nice mails on it since the book came out, so I'm pleased.
Well, I'm glad, as it played into conversation we were having, that the stars are going to be colonized by people, not necessarily the elite. We needed the elite astronauts to pave the way, but when the colonies are built, they're going to have to be the everyday people. And I thought it was very nicely covered in the story. And
Yeah, that was my thought as well. I thought, and I still think this, you know, right now with NASA and the space station, for the most part, with very rare exception, you have to have a PhD to go up into space. But I've always thought that if we get to the point that Elon Musk is trying to get us to, where we have sprawling space infrastructure across the moon, across Mars, maybe the asteroids and beyond, it's going to be more hard hat territory. We're going to have the micro people, the dirty jobs people are going to be in there. So most definitely we're going to have a hard hat society in space, and it's going to have to be technical, obviously technical, but you're going to have you know, the guy with his lunch pail who's going to be out there working. You're going to have the guy and the girl with the lunch pail.
Exactly. For our watchers, we have a number of people with other commitments, and I'm going to go ahead. We are right at about an hour and 45 minutes, which is normal for a LibertyCon double panel. And we are so happy that you joined us today and happy to provide this content. And every single one of us is looking forward to seeing every single one of you at a convention in the future. And go out, if you haven't already read, bought and read The Founder Effect, then you're missing something fantastic. And there it is. Thank you, Mark. He got his right in front of him. Yes, and I think I'm going to have to do some sort of a special giveaway for our readers. I might have to come up with something. I know there's a couple of our authors here that are experts in how to do that. So I will be conferring with you a little bit later about that. And so maybe we do something like the first LibertyCon attendee that emails us about this might just get themselves a free book. So we could do something like that. At any rate, so thank you all, and to the authors, you are way too kind in
thanks everybody
in your comments, and we're just really happy to have everybody here. So
Thanks for letting me tag
joining.
on at the end. I appreciate it.
Not a problem. Not a problem.
Oh, see, I thought you were here the entire time because you're a warrant officer and they're practically invisible.
Hey, that's a perfect explanation. That's a great retcon. I love that.
It's like Drax.
Yes.